Maybe the most controversial area of neuroscience, what emotions are in the brain, how they're produced, how our feelings of our body actually feed into our emotional state. So if you can take control of that feeling state of those sensations and strengthening connections between prefrontal areas and areas like the amygdala and the insular cortex, learn techniques like meditation for calming that response and changing that feeling in real time, how that can dramatically shift your mood, your emotion in the next moment.
Do you think that there's any proven protocols or things that people can implement tomorrow to start acting out the research of positive psychology, growth mindset, anything where you can just start bettering yourself?
There's sort of three general areas that you should focus on if you want to build resilience, psychological resilience, ability to bounce back from difficulties in your life. The first is taking control of negative emotions. One concrete strategy people could use is the second bucket would be upregulating the positive, so enhancing positive emotions. How can you learn from a negative experience, but also how can you savor positive experiences? How can you congratulate yourself for doing something right? And one of the most well-researched protocols is in positive psychology is the 3 good things exercise, which is write down 3 good things that happened in the last 24 hours. Then what role did you play in making that happen? And then how did it make you feel? And this has been shown to increase positive emotion and increase like a sense of efficacy in one's life. The third and final bucket of resilience is
What is the neuroscience of intrinsic motivation, and how can we become more intrinsically motivated?
Intrinsic motivation, there's been a lot of psychological benefits shown when people engage more in activities that are intrinsically motivating for them. You can learn to like more difficult things. You can kind of train yourself to enjoy things that are more challenging. You can reframe what you're doing in any given moment to feel more intrinsically motivated. Came across some study, or at least one study that looked at, it was I think it was several hundred students they were looking at, and they asked them questions about purpose. It was a questionnaire. Do you have a sense of purpose in life? And one of the constructs that they identified was awakening to purpose. So feeling like, I know what my life's purpose is. That had a stronger correlation with resilience, with psychological resilience.
Andrew Cooper Sansone, otherwise known as SenseofMind on his YouTube channel, is a prolific neuroscience communicator and content creator. With the biochemistry background, he's incredibly knowledgeable on different brain systems and is packed with information on how we can improve our lives using neuroscience. All of this made for a really, really engaging conversation with Andrew. If you've ever enjoyed the podcast or what we're trying to do here by speaking to the brightest and the best in neuroscience, then subscribe on YouTube and follow on Spotify. It really makes a huge difference. Thank you so much and enjoy the episode.
Andrew, you have made over 300 pieces of content, actually 365 pieces of neuroscience content as of today. What is the most interesting thing that you've learned about the brain?
Wow, that's funny you say that. I didn't even know that exact number. The most interesting thing I've learned about the brain, that's a good question. I would just say that the more you learn about it, the more difficult it seems to understand. I think we all kind of have like an intuitive sort of idea about what's going on in our heads, and the more you dig into how could these things actually work, the more mysterious it becomes. And an example, I guess, like the prime example is like consciousness. I mean, I think that it's the most real thing to any of us. We're sitting here and experiencing all sorts of colors and sounds and other kinds of qualia and experiences, and that seems perfectly normal to us. But when you look in the brain, when you start looking at the people or the studies that are actually trying to understand how is the brain producing consciousness, it gets more, it just doesn't seem to make that much sense. It seems like there's no explanation that could really satisfies. But I don't think everything's like that, and I think there's plenty of things that are totally fascinating about the brain. I mean, the evolution of the brain, just the various levels of complexity that you can try to understand the brain at. So yeah, that's probably not a very coherent or small, short answer to your question, but there's a lot to know about it, I guess.
No, there isn't. There isn't a short, snappy, coherent answer to that. I think, and exactly as the more you learn about it, the less coherent and the less snappy it gets. I think you can really appreciate that someone has deep knowledge when they don't just give a one-word rehearsed answer. Because there's so many insane things going on in the brain, and you get. I think as someone who tries to learn about the brain every day, it just constantly humbles you. Do you have a good example of like something you've learned even recently about the brain that's really humbled you, where you're like, God, I really thought I knew what was going on up there. I thought I had some idea of what was going on, and then I'm learning this completely new area that's just completely humbled me in that regard.
Yeah, I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about the neuroscience of emotions. I've read a lot about it, and that is one of the things that it is possibly, maybe other than consciousness, let's say, it is maybe the most controversial area of neuroscience in terms of what is the final story on what emotions are in the brain, how they're produced, whether they're innate qualities of that just arise as a product of our genetic wiring. Are they a product of social construction? Are they psychologically constructed? And when I first started learning about that, I was really convinced of the kind of basic emotions theory. People like Jaak Panksepp, who have basically posited that there are these individual circuits, especially in the subcortical regions of the brain, that produce emotions when they're activated. And then I discovered various other perspectives like Lisa Feldman Barrett and Antonio Damasio and a whole host of people. And what you start to realize is it's really difficult to even get on the same wavelength in terms of like the language you're using to discuss what is an emotion. And that absolutely humbled me. I think it's an area with a lot of really strong opinions and not too much extremely solid conclusions, let's say.
Emotions is a great example, and it's funny because it's actually, if you were to ask me the exact same question, emotions is exactly the answer I would have given. I just read how emotions are made this year, and it feels weird to learn about how, or at least one theory about how an emotion is made when you're a 26-year-old man. It's like one of the things you think and I really didn't. And at least if you fully believe Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory, which I do believe is one of the best ones, not only for its infrastructure and what it gives you, but I think believing in that theory is so beneficial for life. I've found that I can take away a lot of practical life things from believing that theory. Like, so to give a little bit of a synopsis, and I'm sure you'd do a better job at this than me. The predicted theory of emotion that Lisa Feldman Barrett really parrots is one where we don't just react to the world happens and then we react to it, but our brain is always making predictions about the world, predictions based on our past experiences, our learned concepts, our languages. And for me, that theory gives you a lot more autonomy in how you deal with your emotion and how you deal with the world. You're not some reactionary organism that's just, deterministic in its reaction to something happening. You actually have autonomy over, okay, yeah, I'm nervous stepping on stage here in front of 1,000 people, but maybe I can get that nervous energy into excitement. Maybe I can turn that into confidence, and there's been research that's been done there. What do you think about the leading theories of emotion? Where do you have a horse in that race? Would you put your betting money in on one theory or another?
I don't know that I would bet on any one of them right now, partly because going back to your question about what humbles me, I mean, the sheer amount of information and research in each of these camps is kind of staggering. But, on your point about Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, I I definitely think that she's got a lot going for her work, and especially if you look at her formal like published theory of the constructed theory of emotions, which was published I think just before her book. It's a little bit more in depth on how the brain is actually doing this stuff and how she sees that. But I would say that a lot of them are actually compatible with the idea that you just described of changing, kind of using your conscious mind, your thoughts, your internal language and dialogue to actually shift your emotional state. So, for example, Jaak Panksepp's theory. He's now passed away a few years ago, but he was the leading researcher in basically, or the leading theorist in what he called primary process emotions. And he has this book called The Archaeology of Mind. And I'm not saying that I'm endorsing this theory, but just to sort of show that they are kind of compatible with our everyday experience of emotions. So he says there's these subcortical circuits, right, that run through areas like the brainstem, the amygdala, and like the dopamine system, basically. And you've got these individual circuits that are producing various emotional states. But that is only the first level of what he's talking about. So he's saying that's the primary process. And then you have this secondary and tertiary process on top of that, that is sort of integrating and then describing and kind of elaborating on that feeling, that initial experience of the emotion, and that we have actually a lot of control in terms of that tertiary process, which, to simplify it, would basically be like the cortex talking to these subcortical circuits and sort of changing their activity. And so even though I do agree that Lisa Feldman Barrett's research, her ideas carry a lot of weight and are really, she writes very persuasively, I'll also say that. These other theories, I think, do also provide some of that same, insight into how to understand our emotional lives. But that didn't answer your question. I don't really have a individual theory that I'm most attracted to.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think Lisa Feldman Barrett's also a brilliant communicator of ideas. She's brilliant at just speaking. Whenever I listen to her in a lecture series, she's just so convincing in what she says. I just want thousands of hours of her online speaking because I think she's a great speaker. I love her on podcasts and everything. And that does make anything she says more compelling if she says it in such an eloquent and confident way. I'm curious to dive into the topic of neuroscience communication. What's your goal as a neuroscience communicator? What are you really trying to achieve?
That's a good question. I think the goal of my channel really is to give people a reasonably accurate understanding of how their brain works in various specific domains, to try to give them some insight into how to live a better life, how to live a happier, more fulfilling life. Kind of what you were just describing with emotions. How do you shift your emotional state? What is going on in your brain that can give you insight into how to kind of tweak that process, take advantage of it a little bit more fully. But on a broader level, as a science communicator, I see our role as developing a sort of expertise in understanding what researchers are saying and really trying to dive deep and understanding that the whole picture and in as far as we can do that, and then bring that to an audience in a way that isn't distorting it too much. And I say not too much because I think there's an inevitable amount of sort of, if you want to call it distortion or simplification, that occurs when you are going from the hard science and then bringing it to people that don't have really any solid background in that science. I mean, I have a bachelor's degree in cellular and molecular biology, and then I spent time working in neuroscience research labs, and then I've just been reading this stuff for a long time. But even it takes time to really understand an issue and then try to communicate it in a way that's not distorting it too much for like the general public, say.
Absolutely. It's a good way of thinking about it. I think that we're sort of intermediaries between researchers and a general audience. Why do you think neuroscience specifically is such a difficult space to do communication in? And beyond just the complexity of the topic, do you think there's something else that makes neuroscience really hard to communicate to people? Because one thing that kind of baffles me is that there isn't very much content for neuroscience out there. Like, obviously Andrew Huberman has blown up in the last couple of years, but before him there wasn't really a neuroscience communicator that was prominent and doing a very good job at taking these difficult topics and condensing them down. And there was no one that was being received by a wide audience. You know, he was on Jimmy Fallon a few days ago. It's like, that's never happened before. Why is neuroscience specifically a really hard, complex topic to condense down and to communicate to people?
Well, I think part of it is it's a very young, very young area of study, very young science in the grand scheme of things. I mean, especially when we're talking about the new methods like fMRI and these ability to image the brain and see what it's doing in real time. That's really new, and that has given us a lot of data, like an enormous amount of insight into how the brain works. So that's one thing. I think another thing is just the anatomical jargon is unbelievable in neuroscience.
Crazy.
You could pick a brain region and it has like 5 different names. And I'm not exaggerating, because different neuroscientists will define the borders of that brain region differently, unless you're talking about something very kind of modular, like the amygdala. There's not much disagreement on what that is. But, you know, when it comes to the cortex, which has kind of been the focus of neuroscience, especially for the last, 20 years maybe, it's hard to define what those areas are. And then people get lost in that jargon. Like when you're saying words like periaqueductal gray, rostral anterior cingulate cortex, it's like people, they just get lost and like, okay, what are you talking about? So I think that leads to a tendency for communicators to tend to really simplify it down and just say your brain does this, rather than trying to break down what the mechanisms are, what's going on. So, there's a lot going on there. Yeah, I will say, just on your point about science communicators, I mean, I do think there have been some before Huberman, certainly not as big, to your point, like Robert Sapolsky and a couple others. But I also share your opinion that it has been pretty barren, especially for neuroscience.
Yeah, finding that balance is so difficult, because you really don't want to be the spreader of misinformation. And you condense a topic down enough by just virtue of like the limitation of words and language. You're going to say something where you're going to get a comment, well, actually, it's not really that way because of this. And I'm like, yeah, I know that, but because like it's just so hard. And in my content, I really try and not use that jargon, but you can't get away with it the whole time. You know, I wish there was almost just a completely different way that you could display these things. I mean, I think with really good animation software, it would be really interesting. Like if we had 5 years from now, the animation software that we could use in neuroscience, and we could show things just with shapes, and like we can show things with connections, and we had like a really good way of visually displaying these areas. You could almost cut the language out completely, or the language will become less complicated because it's attached to visual structures. You know, I've thought a lot about how you might visualize neuroscience and everything. So I'm hoping that, AI animation down the line will make those things easier, because the jargon is just impossible to get around, and impossible not to say incorrect things when you're simplifying it down.
Yeah, no, I think that would be amazing, especially with AI, as you mentioned. And the other thing is that as communicators, as you get more and more into learning about this stuff, those kinds of, that jargon starts to seem natural to you. And then you might start saying it, and then the audience kind of falls off, and they're like, what are you talking about? So that's kind of the other side of that, when you are, not oversimplifying it, but undersimplifying it, let's say.
Absolutely. The curse of knowledge is huge. You're yes. Talking about the anterior cingulate cortex to your granny, and it's like, why is she not getting this? I don't understand it. I'm curious because you said one of the primary purposes of your channel is that you want to dispel neuroscience knowledge, but what's important to you is that someone takes away something that they can apply in their life. I'm curious how you apply your knowledge of neuroscience in life. Like, what changes have you made because of what you've learned about the brain?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest changes for me have been in the area of emotion regulation, of understanding the role that And you could even go to something like interoception. So when I first started learning about interoception, which is basically the perception of the internal milieu, the internal sensations of your body. When I first started learning about how our feelings of our body actually feed into our emotional state, and how if you can sort of regulate and take control of that feeling state of those sensations and reinterpret them, or even just learn techniques like meditation for calming that response and changing that feeling in real time, how that can dramatically shift your mood, your emotion in the next moment. I mean, I think those have been some of the biggest. Learning about the neuroscience of meditation, of mindfulness, while that's also a very new area and there's controversy, some of the best science seems to show that with regular meditation, we improve our ability to regulate emotions, possibly partly by sort of strengthening connections between prefrontal areas and areas like the amygdala and the insular cortex. And that allows us to take control and sort of turn down that emotional response. But yeah, there's a number of different things. I mean, last year I really started learning about positive psychology, which is this field concerned with basically the study of human flourishing and psychological flourishing and happiness. And I learned about the work of Martin Seligman, who kind of founded the field, and his colleague, Stephen Mayer. And they discovered, this is in mice, so this hasn't been fully extrapolated or studied in humans yet, but this pretty interesting circuit, I won't go into details to bore your listeners with all the neuroanatomical jargon, but basically looking at learned helplessness and how repeated stressors repeated uncontrollable stressors can put us into this state of learned helplessness, where when we face what is actually a controllable stressor, we're less likely to take action when we actually could take control of that. And it's sort of been a model for depression and other things, but I noticed that in my own life. And then when I started learning about the neuroscience and how the prefrontal cortex is so involved with shutting off this response, at least again in mice, it changed my way of looking at it. That, okay, I think overall, to answer your question, it's about seeing a physical mechanism and then understanding that when you are thinking in a certain way, when you're changing your behavior in a certain way, you are actually shifting which particular mechanisms are active at any given moment.
Yeah, I like the learned helplessness part. I think if I could summarize down what my entire goal with neuroscience communication would be, is just to get it across to people that they aren't helpless with how they act and how they react with their brain. Like, they have just so much more autonomy, agency, and control in reaction to anything. And I don't think that's really in the common space. I don't think that's really talked about. You know, people like to be victims, and they like to say that this thing happened to them and they couldn't have reacted. They say that their life has been misery for X, Y, and Z. But for some reason, that sense of control, they like to dispel that control as like an outside force that they have no agency over. You know, and I think the more you learn about neuroscience and the more you learn about the brain, is just how powerful it is to do anything that you want to do, really. And like, there's the most incredible cases, obviously, of people going through the worst traumas imaginable, and then purely through a perceptual flip and a mindset change, they're able to just come out of it on the other side, you know? And that should be a thing that everybody knows, you know, that they can wake up on any given day and they can radically change their life. They have agency, they have control. Would you agree with all of that?
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree with all that. Yeah, I think it speaks to a lot of this work in, like, again, back to positive psychology, but specifically with growth mindset, the work of Carol Dweck, Stanford psychologist, just looking at, when you see failures and setbacks as reflective of your personal defects that are permanent to you, that is what she refers to as a fixed mindset. And on the other hand, if you look at these failures, setbacks, learning opportunities, as actual, okay, what can I do with this? How could I be better in the future? And that I can, in fact, improve. At least according to her research, there, again, bit of controversy around this, but that this does lead to better results, better psychological health, all kinds of important outcomes that we want for people. And it also goes to a very sticky question, especially in neuroscience, which is free will. And I know you had Kevin Freeman, that's his last name, right?
Kevin Mitchell.
Mitchell, why? Freeman, because free will, I don't know. I'm reading his book right now too. But anyway, so you had him on your podcast about his book, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. And on my podcast, we had a whole episode on free will. And I think it's important that we retain this concept of free will, and it may be a constrained version of free will, but for precisely the reasons that you were just talking about, it is important to convey to people that they do have will, they do have volition and the ability to change through kind of conscious effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any practical takeaways beyond, because it's very easy for us to say, you should just believe this. Do you think that there's any proven protocols or things that people can implement tomorrow to start acting out the research of positive psychology, growth mindset, anything where you can just start bettering yourself or improving it? Is there any protocols or things that you do on a given day to really support these things?
Yeah, I mean, some are more supported by research than others, but so I recently made this video on resilience. And I think it captures a lot of what we're talking about here. And I kind of boiled it down to there's sort of three general areas that you should focus on if you want to build resilience, with psychological resilience, ability to bounce back from difficulties in your life. And the first is taking control of negative emotions. So one concrete strategy people could use is something like reappraisal or reframing. And this has been known through decades of research in cognitive behavioral therapy and in psychology. But just this idea that when something bad happens to you, or when something seems to be going wrong, when you're having a negative emotion in reaction to something, you can change your interpretation of what's happening. So as a really trivial example, like if you're in driving in traffic, let's say, and somebody cuts you off, right? You can either say, oh, that guy's such a jerk, like why me? That was horrible, and then freak out or something. Or you can think, okay, oh, maybe that person is on the way to the hospital, or maybe, like looking at it in a different kind of light. And that's just one example. Another example might be affect labeling. This is another strategy that's derived from therapy, from cognitive behavioral therapy. There's research that shows that when people just name an emotion that they're experiencing, just either write it down or just verbally communicate it, it can actually reduce the negative affect associated with that emotion, allow you to move forward more quickly. And there's a lot more strategies for down-regulating the negative, let's say, reducing negative affect. And that's kind of the first bucket. The second bucket would be up-regulating the positive, so enhancing positive emotions. And I think this is something that has been kind of ignored largely in psychology and neuroscience up until the advent of positive psychology in the 1970s. And so there are ways to kind of tune your life, change the certain things that will lead you to more positive states, more positive emotional states. And a good acronym to remember is PERMA, and that's PERMA, and it stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, achievement. And that's just a kind of a framework that's used in positive psychology to look at, like, when people maximize each of these areas, it seems to lead to more flourishing. But to get a little more concrete, I mean, I think in terms of actually up-regulating positive emotion, this sounds so like simplistic, but it is important to think positively. It's important to try to look at the positive. And like I was talking about with growth mindset before, how can you learn from a negative experience, but also how can you savor positive experiences? How can you congratulate yourself for doing something right? And one of the most well-researched protocols is in positive psychology is the 3 good things exercise, which was developed, I think, originally by Martin Seligman. But anyway, it's this activity you can take. You do like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, however long you want to take to do this. But at the end of your day or whenever you have time, write down 3 good things that happened in the last 24 hours, focusing on so writing the positive thing, here's what happened, and then what role did you play in making that happen? And then how did it make you feel? And this has been shown to increase positive emotion and increase like a sense of efficacy in one's life. That's one example. There's others. There's a tool called Looking Forward, which doesn't have nearly as much research behind it, but it's basically this idea that if you journal about things that you're looking forward to in the future and how that makes you feel, there's some research showing that it can reduce symptoms of depression and increase measures of psychological flourishing. So those are a couple ideas of how to kind of upregulate the positive. And then I know I've been rambling here, but the third and final bucket of resilience is I would say physical health. So I think exercise, diet, sleep, you could throw maybe meditation in there, but I think exercise is often really overlooked. And exercise has a whole host of benefits just physically, right? So you're just going to feel better typically if you engage in regular exercise. But it also has effects on the brain. There's some research showing that it can help sort of optimize the function of the brain's dopamine system, which is involved in a lot of these positive emotions and also in motivated behavior. So there's a lot there, but I would say overall it's regulating negative emotions, upregulating positive emotions, and taking care of your physical health.
That was an awesome consensus and very succinct, amazing. I think there's a lot of practical things that people can take away there. I have a lot in response, but I think that was a brilliant synopsis. I'm an exercise freak. When I don't exercise, my life's going downhill, and I can almost always directly correlate how many times I've exercised per week in terms of my life trajectory, in terms of going upwards. But I also think that exercise links in with all those other things that you've said there as well. For me, especially, it's gratitude. So I've been doing triathlon recently, which is a lot of endurance training, just out cycling, out running, out swimming. And when I have a really good session, I find myself just in the woods I live in Barcelona in Spain. So up in the mountains by myself, and I'm just running and it's nothing around me. I get an almost transcendent psychedelic like experience of gratitude. And for me, it's when I feel most alive. But gratitude, I think, is at the core of it. And it's a gratitude that I have a physical body that can move me through space in this way. And in those moments, everything else collapses. I don't have an ego. I don't have status. I don't have all of my, bullshit prefrontal cortex stuff that rambles on. That all of the stuff that is societally driven, social media, all of that stuff, it just collapses. And what's left is like a singular gratitude for my physical health, and a profound gratitude. And sometimes it even goes so far as saying like, I'm so grateful that I have my right arm. I'm so grateful that I have my left arm. And I literally, it sounds corny, but I literally go through like one by one and just be like, it's hard to even explain with words how grateful I am that I have my physical body, that I can move through space. And as long as I have that physical health, what else matters? It gives me an amazing comparison and like relative point of like nothing else matters. Any like fight or argument that I had with somebody or it all just collapses. It all just disappears. And it's sad to me that not everybody has that. Or I'm not saying it has to be, long endurance running in the mountains, but I think people need to find whatever that gratitude moment is where everything goes quiet. All of the bullshit that we get pulled into in 2024 just collapses because none of it matters, and that's actually true. Like, none of it actually matters. But you need an exercise that induces that state. I'm curious if is that what you get through meditation? Is that sort of a similar sense of like just quieting of the mind, reduce all the chatter, to tune everything down, and just you're at peace with oneself?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that's a beautiful description of gratitude. And I should have mentioned gratitude. It's so important. There's so much research around it in positive psychology. Yes, I think to answer your question, meditation absolutely has that effect for me. I've been practicing meditation for like 5 years now. And I think especially when you get into a longer meditation state, it does have that. It's like thoughts are there, emotions are there, feelings are there, but it doesn't bother you, right? It's just moving away. And I would say I think exercise is distinct, but I completely agree with what you're saying. And I do mountain biking and hiking and stuff. I live in the mountains of Colorado. And so it's a similar thing. It's incredible. And just being grateful for the beauty around you. And there's some research on the emotion of awe, on sort of like awe-inspiring experiences, and how positive a thing that can be for people. And I think as you were describing that, I was thinking about it because awe researchers tend to talk about the falling away of the self, the feeling that there's this something much greater than yourself all around you. I'm not a religious person, but just the beauty and vastness of nature can be humbling, but in the most beautiful and satisfying way. Yeah, I think exactly as you were saying, it is important to have those experiences that let you turn down the volume on everything else that's going on in your life. And I think exercise is just such a great way to do that. I always advocate for meditation as being in addition to exercise, because I think it does give something a little bit different, but very similar and related for sure.
Yeah, I gave meditation about a 60-day go, and I really tried. And I'd say I really enjoyed it for an extended amount of weeks where I was doing it consistently, and I could feel progress, in inverted commas, whatever progress means when it comes to meditation. But I was more still. I was less restless, less fidgety. It didn't stick in the daily routine. Exercise for me is like, I can't not put on the shoes and get out. Meditation was like, another day's passed and I haven't ticked it off. It became a tick box exercise, what I call it. And then you get into like a negative psychological routine of like, oh, I didn't tick that box. And then I was like, okay, well, if I just feel bad about every day for not meditating, and it's probably going to have an overall negative effect. But I'm curious, this psychology of awe is really interesting to me. How do you think we can maximize the psychology of awe with what you know about neuroscience and the brain mechanisms of awe in a world of TikTok, Instagram, social media, constant bombardment? How do you think those things relate?
Well, that's a good question. I think the neuroscience of awe, I looked into this a while ago. It is pretty sparse, I'll say that. There's some work on it, but the psychology of awe is a lot better fleshed out. And there's this great book by a guy named Dacher Keltner, who's a researcher in the US, and he has done a lot of work on, and I think the lesson of that book is it's nature. Well, this is one of the lessons. Nature is a very potent way of experiencing awe. And I think it's not coincidental that when you're in nature, you're typically not looking at your phone. You're not looking at TikTok. You're not going on Instagram, scrolling YouTube, whatever it might be. You're out there and you are fully engaged in the experience. And I think this goes to a larger point, or an aspect of going back to positive psychology, but on research on flow states. And how when we're fully focused in on something, and can become absorbed into it, we tend to report those as extremely positive experiences. And there's this saying that I think it comes from a research paper, I think is the title of one. I can't remember who it was, but it's a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And it's this idea that even when you're working on or doing something that's not inherently pleasant, if you're focused on it and you're not getting distracted by a whole bunch of other things, you tend to enjoy or at least report that experience as more positive than the person who's, constantly checking their phone and looking and doing something else here and there. But yeah, I think it's important to try to get into nature. And I know most human beings live in cities, large cities, so it's not always the easiest thing to do, but there are also experiences of awe that are available in that city context. I mean, I know for me, when I go to, a big city, London or New York or something like that, just the sheer magnitude of the buildings, the skyscrapers, and what human beings have done to transform this area into something really a complex system that is a city. That's amazing. When you start to contemplate that, that can give you this awe-inspiring experience. But I think, to your point, it is essential to get away from your phone, because that's just a kind of a short-term dopamine hit that can trick you into just sitting there for hours and hours and not really getting that much out of it.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think about, are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work currently about how he thinks there's basically a great rewiring that's happening in Gen Z, where between 2010 and 2014, there was a huge increase in mental illness, which he is very causally linking with social media and, very immediate dopamine feedback loops through TikTok, through Instagram, and all these things. And I'm reading his book at the moment, but I'm curious, what do you think about future generations, how they're using social media, how they're using mobile phones, and how they're maybe not experiencing that sense of awe and just getting further and further away from our evolutionary self? Kind of curious for you to talk around that topic for a while.
Sure, that's a good question. I haven't read his most recent book. I've read his other two books, or his last two books anyway. And he talked a little bit about that in The Coddling of the American Mind, which I think was his previous book. And I've seen him talk about this a little bit before. I think there's something to what he's saying. I'm not a social psychologist, and I haven't spent much time studying this at all. So just that caveat there. I mean, I think it's absolutely possible that people are spending too much time on their phones, and especially younger generations. I mean, it's just like wild to me that kids these days are going to be growing up with artificial intelligence as a normal part, or at least, these large language models as a normal part of their educational experience. That is just kind of mind-blowing and completely different than what I grew up with and how my education was. But when it comes to social media, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think it's a kind of, especially when you look at something like Twitter or X, whatever, seems like a very unhealthy space for people to be in. And I don't spend pretty much any time on social media except for my channel, which tends to be a very positive experience because I'm looking at stuff that I'm inherently interested in. I'm communicating with people like you and others who are in this space, and it tends to be more positive. So I think there's a way that you can curate what you're doing on social media to make it more positive and more rewarding and refueling rather than just completely draining. But I'll admit that I do sometimes find myself just scrolling the YouTube Shorts feed, and I'm like, I know that this is going to make me feel bad, later on, like just not going to feel as good as I would have. But I do it anyway. And so that's something I work on personally. But yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely possible that there's some kind of rewiring going on in terms of our social cognition, in terms of our attention. So I would just encourage people to realize, like, this isn't like, I'm not like scolding the younger generation to get off your phone and never look at it. I mean, I think they're like amazing tools. I think you just have to be careful about how you use it and realize that it is addictive, like maybe not as addictive as drugs or something like that. But it's important to realize, like, that's not the point of life, I guess.
Do you have
Not
any
a
intuition?
satisfying answer.
No. Again, a lot of these things don't have right or wrong answers, right? They're just interesting conversation topics to just flaunt about. Like, do you have any intuition on what you think the next generations will be missing? As someone who's, I know you spent a lot of time studying the evolution of the brain, as someone who knows so much about the brain and development, do you have any intuition for how that might affect them developing when they are living such a radically different life? Like the things that they're missing and how crucial they are to properly regulated, emotionally regulated, socially regulated, all the different ways that we need to develop as humans.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to like brain development and especially development in adolescence, that is like the period from, basically the end of childhood and then before adulthood. So to put a number on it, maybe like 12 to 22 years old, depending on, your level of maturity and all that. But that period, we can all agree, especially the teenage years, that's a really critical period for human development, for brain development. Your brain is incredibly plastic during that time. There's a lot of changes going on. And one of the most, I think, compelling theories in the kind of neuroscience and psychology of adolescent brain development is that this is a period for gathering new experiences, for understanding the world socially, physically, in a lot of different ways. And I think that's something Jonathan Haidt does talk about a little bit. But yeah, I think it's possible that when you're looking at your phone all the time and that's like your main focus and there's so much content there that you could just endlessly explore, it could possibly, I don't know, it could sort of take advantage of that adolescent period where we are just drawn to exploring and having these novel experiences and taking risks and doing all kinds of things that adolescents, that teenagers do, that prepares them for later life to learn about how the world works and to kind of develop that wisdom later in life. It could be impairing to that period because if you're just only exploring this electronic digital landscape, you're not really learning about the world. I mean, maybe if we're all in a few years in the Matrix, maybe they'll have like an advantage because they spent so much time in the Matrix, but I don't think that'll happen. And I think, yeah, it's absolutely possible. I mean, I know kids or now young adults who are kind of in Gen Z or a little bit, I mean, the lower end of Gen Z, the youngest of Gen Z, who, yeah, I think some of them probably do spend too much time on their phone, but then again, there are new ways of interacting with real humans through these phones. Like I know somebody who she would actually stay up not stay up all night, but have her FaceTime on with her friend, and they would have virtual sleepovers basically. And so I think that could possibly be a healthier way to engage with it rather than just scrolling through TikTok. But yeah, I think that period of adolescent brain development, we're very explorative during that period. And so if all you're doing is exploring the digital landscape, you're not learning that much about the real world.
Yeah. It's all speculative. I think my bias is slightly more pessimism because I would agree with basically everything you said there. As mammals, we're wired to play, and playing is so important, and unsupervised play. And Haidt talks about this a lot, and I think I agree with him completely, really, where play is where you push the social boundaries. It's where you figure out what you can and can't do. And if you're maybe children spend 80% of their time playing, just as a random number, in the 1990s, early 2000s, that's going to be radically reduced. And that's almost just an objective fact that the amount of time the children that spend unsupervised play, learning social rules, falling over, doing physical things, tuning their balance skills, playing sport. There's just so many different things that it seemed to me they're going to be slightly underdeveloped if you just spend so much time training only your thumbs for swiping and your fingers. They might have incredible finger dexterity from swiping on digital devices, but yeah, I'm generally pessimistic, but I try not to let that bias come through, and I try and look at the data. You've done a lot of interesting videos on intrinsic motivation. I'm curious about what is the neuroscience of intrinsic motivation, and how can we become more intrinsically motivated?
Yeah, good question. So intrinsic motivation is kind of what it sounds like. It's the type of motivation that it's sorts of activities that you just inherently enjoy doing, that you want to do for their own sake, really. So intrinsic motivation, there's been a lot of psychological benefits shown when people engage more in activities that are intrinsically motivating for them. And that can sound kind of trivial, like, oh, if you do what you want to do, then you'll be happier, of course. Okay, great. But I think where the rubber meets the road is realizing that you can learn to like more difficult things. You can kind of train yourself to enjoy things that are, more challenging and that aren't that enjoyable when you first start doing them, but that as you gain some kind of mastery and experience with it, you feel like you feel more of that intrinsic motivation toward it. So, and we were talking about exercise, for example. I mean, I know, like, I didn't, when I was like 20 years old, I wasn't that into exercise. I mean, I did it, I knew like it was important and stuff, but it wasn't like something I really pushed myself on. And I remember when I turned 21, I was like, okay, I want to start doing this because I want the results. I want to feel better. I want to, look better. I want to be healthier in a longer term sense. And as I trained, like as I did, weightlifting and running and all these things, I started feeling much more positively toward that. And then, as you described earlier, like I can't go a day without exercising, or when I do, I'm just like, okay, when am I going to get back to it?
Yeah.
But I think an important thing about intrinsic motivation is that you can shift, going back to that reframing idea, you can reframe what you're doing in any given moment to feel more intrinsically motivating. So as an example, like if you are, let's say you're in college, right? And you're studying for an exam, right? And it's kind of a grueling process. Maybe it's a calculus exam, let's say, and you're studying and you're just getting frustrated. You're not understanding these things. And you're like, why am I doing this? Well, that's a really important question to ask. Why are you doing this? Because when you can bring that purpose to, like the larger purpose to these immediate experiences or immediate behaviors, these things that you're carrying out, it can make it a lot more enjoyable, or at least a lot more meaningful, and you'll feel a lot more motivated to do that thing when you realize, okay, I'm studying calculus because I want to get this degree, because I want to study this, I want to do this in the future, whatever your long-term goals might be, bringing that long-term to the immediate present moment, that can be really important for developing intrinsic motivation. To get to your question about the neuroscience of intrinsic motivation, this is also a pretty young area of neuroscience, but from what I learned, there is a lot of, and this is not really surprising for anybody who's looked into the neuroscience of motivation, there's a lot of involvement of the dopamine systems. So these are that's kind of a term, an umbrella term for a number of different nuclei and brain areas that are connected with, that use the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so some of the most important regions are like the ventral striatum, or the striatum more generally, which is kind of deep in the brain, part of the basal ganglia, and the prefrontal cortex. Those are kind of some of the main players in this. And it seems like when we're intrinsically motivated, we can have a more, I don't want to mischaracterize the science because it's been a while since I've looked at this, but I believe a more sustainable kind of what's called like a tonic dopamine level. So like a higher tonic dopamine level, so a higher baseline level of dopamine when we're engaging more in intrinsic motivation type activities. But in general, I think what's been shown is the engagement of the dopamine systems. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's something it's been a while since I've looked specifically into it, but that's kind of, I think, the general outline.
No, I think that's a good synopsis. I think it makes sense. I mean, we don't really want our motivation in large troughs and peaks, right? I mean, we want to set ourselves up so that we wake up relatively consistently motivated every single day, because that's where you make consistent progress. So shifting your internal motivation more intrinsically by going through these different exercises and connecting them, I think that has a lot of utility. I've had this interesting sort of realization with myself related to extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And one thing that I've noticed is that the more I externalize what I achieve and what I do, especially as it comes to exercise, the less intrinsic it becomes, which is quite obvious, right? It's not intrinsic if you're telling everybody about it. So the more I'm telling people, oh, I went to the gym and I lifted 20. I mean, there's some good social feedback from that as well. But I found, at least personally, the more I say boasted or even exaggerated at times about my outward physical accomplishments, the less intrinsic it became and the less motivated I became to do it. So something I purposely started doing a number of years ago is I would actually under exaggerate. There's a better word for that, but I would underplay basically what I was doing physically out to my friends and outwardly. So if I ran 10K, I would actually tell people I ran 8. And what I felt that did is, one, it felt really good because I was like, I don't need to tell them the full accomplishment. That's for me. But if you undersell it, you really are keeping that value for yourself. You can be very consistent perceptually thinking, I actually am doing this for myself because I'm underplaying the social reward that I would get from actually saying exactly what I did. And I found that the more I did that and the more I undersold it to people and the more I just even kept it to myself and didn't externalize it, the more intrinsically motivated I was to exercise. And then there was an inverse relationship. The more I talked about it, the more I gloated, the more I exaggerated, the more I boasted, the more I got the social reward. So I wonder, I think like social reward and intrinsic reward also sort of maybe sit on opposite ends of the balance. And the more you feed that social reward, it can even subconsciously start tipping that scales and you become less intrinsically motivated. So that's something I think I've noticed myself. And I'm so curious about what you think that does neurologically, how you think that subtly rewires or changes the dopamine circuits to just make you slightly more motivated on any given day.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's I had never heard that strategy before, but I think it does make sense, at least insofar as I think that when we are doing things because other people want us to do them, or we perceive that other people want us to do them, just as you mentioned, there's going to be less intrinsic motivation there. And yeah, I think that's definitely like a way that we could sort of keep it to ourselves to know, like, I did actually do this activity, but I'm not going to like brag about that because what I'm not going for is the social reward. That's not what I'm after, right? I definitely see the utility in that. I do think there is something to verbalizing your accomplishments, though. And it doesn't, again, like when I was talking about the 3 good things exercise, it doesn't have to be that you're telling other people. But when you tell that to yourself, when you remind yourself what you have done and what you have accomplished, I think that can increase your motivation to go do those hard activities that are going to bring that long-term reward and have more intrinsic motivation, as opposed to being, just driven by social reward or the money or whatever it might be. But yeah, that's something I haven't thought a whole lot about, but really interesting insight.
Yeah, I think it comes down to what your perception is on the topic. Like if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to get so much of a social kick, I can't wait to tell my friends about this, and then you get all your friends saying like, great job, well done, like it really depends on how you take that input and what you turn it into. I think that there are lots of people that are naturally very intrinsically motivated and they could tell everybody, and then vocalizing it is a positive feedback loop there. But I realized, at least for me, it's probably an insecurity, to be honest. There's probably some insecurity there that I felt I needed to vocalize it to earn it, and that lowered my intrinsic motivation. So I guess it's something to note. If you realize that or even, I guess, if you have a tendency to ever exaggerate and you find yourself exaggerating to people, I think that has a huge knock-on effect of lowering your intrinsic motivation. So I think that could be something, if anyone's listening and resonates with that, they might be able to take something away. But I'm curious if that's just me.
Yeah, no, I mean, just like I think on a broader perspective, there is research on motivation and whether your goals are self set or if they're set by someone else, like your parents, or if you just feel like you have to do this thing as a kind of duty for someone else, it's not as motivating. There's some interesting stuff on that when it comes to purpose as well. That I came across some study, or at least one study that looked at, it was, I think it was several hundred students they were looking at, and they asked them questions about purpose, and it was it was a questionnaire where they're filling out, do you have a sense of purpose in life, and all these various questions on it. And they found that there was one of the constructs that they identified was awakening to purpose. So feeling like, I know what my life's purpose is. I know what I want to do with my life. I know what I want to accomplish. These kinds of questions. When people agreed to that, they tended to have a stronger, that had a stronger correlation with resilience, with psychological resilience. Whereas people who were scored higher in the construct that they identified as altruistic purpose. So people that were saying, I want to serve society in many ways, and things that were really extrinsic in terms of their, in terms of social life, right? Like they were talking about serving the collective in many ways. That had the weakest correlation. There was a number of other constructs that they looked at, but that had the weakest correlation with psychological resilience. I know that's kind of a far-flung point, but I think it gets back to this point of being self-motivated rather than listening and just following what other people tell you to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely, I think that's great. So I'm curious, what are you most excited about in neuroscience and neuroscience technology in the next 10 years? And then as the inverse to that, I like to ask everyone on the podcast this question because I'm curious. The inverse to that is, what are you most scared of in the next 10 years? Like what thing could develop that you're thinking about that you think could negatively impact culture and society or anything that you value in the next decade?
Oh man. So specifically neuroscience related, right? Not just
let's keep neuroscience, but also neurotechnology,
Sure.
that sort of avenue.
Yeah, well, I think it might be one and the same. Thing I'm most excited about is also the thing I fear the most, and that would be, I think brain-computer interface is fascinating technology, fascinating idea. I mean, we've all kind of seen those demonstrations with Neuralink, with Elon Musk's company, where they're hooking their brains up to a computer, and they're able to play Pong with just their motor cortex, basically. That's interesting because it's possible that something like that could lead to allowing, quadriplegics, people that are paralyzed, to have more agency in the world, to be able to control even their limbs. If there's if it's a spinal cord injury, and you can have an implant that bypasses that damage in the spine to allow them to control their body and move about in the world and do things. I mean, that would be revolutionary and unbelievably interesting. But also similar to that, I think, the advent of artificial intelligence, of these large language models, and the acceleration and progress that we're seeing in that field. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that we could, it's not necessarily neurotechnology, but we're going to be interfacing with these minds, these artificial minds, if you want to call them that, and that could completely change society in a lot of ways. And then, I think both of those things have the potential for something to be afraid of, right? I mean, I think neurotechnology, it doesn't take much imagination to think about, oh, well, if we all have these implants in our brains, how long does it take for the government or a terrorist group or a company to get a hold of these and start controlling our behavior against our will? That's something that we've never had to face as a society, and we don't know what that would do. And similarly with artificial intelligence, we don't know what sorts of new misinformation or costs we're going to see with this new technology. But I tend to be pretty optimistic about things, and I think that we will have trade-offs, we'll have costs, but I think the world is going to be, especially in the next 10, 20, 50 years, is going to be almost unrecognizable, but unbelievably good and interesting.
I definitely agree that it's going to be undeniably different, unrecognizably different. And I hope that your optimistic view is correct. I think everyone can see the Neuralink case for paralysis, right? I mean, everyone's like, yes, of course we should try and do that. That's a great problem to try and solve. But where do you draw that line? Because, you know, humanity has never been able to, all right, this is enough progress. Let's just halt it here. I mean, regulation would be the artificial halting, or regulation would be the only way that we would stop. Like, how far do you think we should go, or would you go? Like, in terms of sensory expansion, say, you know, like if we can expand out our senses in ways that we can't even think about now and become one with the universe, and in all of this crazy stuff that sounds massively science fiction, but I'm almost sure we're going to deal with some of these things in our lifetimes. You know, where do you stand on like, you know, neuro augmentation and like improving, enhancing neural processes, making people smarter, making people see different colors of a broader spectrum? You know, like there's infinite amount of ways that you can expand the human brain. Where do you think you lie on that as a very broad category?
Again, yeah, I tend to be pretty optimistic, and I also think so. I think, you know, it's possible that we will develop technologies that are really bad for our psychological health, that might have knock-on effects that we can't predict to, you know, maybe the economy or to the environment or things like that. But I tend to think that more technological progress is better than less, and that human beings do have a nature that we don't necessarily go overboard with everything. You know, I mean, like genetic engineering has been around for a while now, and a lot of the doomsday predictions about, you know, that we're going to start a new evolutionary course and we're going to like screw with the genome in a way that is completely disastrous, that it's going to lead to horrible results for all civilization. I don't think those have come true. And I think part of that is because people do kind of genuinely want to live in the real world. And I mean, I don't know. It's there's so many possibilities out there. There's this great book, Live Wired, by David Eagleman, neuroscientist.
Read it. Great book.
Yeah,
That's where I'm getting that idea. He has an idea where you plug your brain into Twitter, and you get like you actually develop I can't think of anything worse, but you actually develop like a perception for what the cultural, I don't know what the cultural ideas are on Twitter at the moment, and you actually feel them in some real sense because your brain is interpreting those electrical signals. Like, he has a lot of things in that book that are absolutely crazy, but really opened up my mind to what the next couple of decades could possibly look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, predictions are hard, especially about the future, right? So I don't know what'll happen, but yeah, I mean, you can tell I have this very positive outlook of the future, because I tend to think that if you look at history and you look at the history of technology, really we are living, I believe, in the best time. Really, you could place yourself anywhere on Earth, and if you said, you know, would you want to live in the year 2024 or any other era in human history, maybe there's a few exceptions, but you'd pretty much have to choose 2024. It's, I think, longevity, all kinds of measures of human prosperity are much higher than they were in the past. And I think that's thanks to largely to this kind of technological innovation that seemed scary when it was coming about, but ultimately improved our lives in ways and had trade-offs. I mean, I'm not, you know, a utopian. I think that there will be trade-offs. There will probably be, you know, we'll lose jobs. We'll lose maybe some kind of sense of what it used to mean to be human. But then again, I think we'll develop new ways of living and a new sense of what it means to be human. But yeah, I'm kind of terrible at making predictions, so I'll leave it at that.
Well, I hope you're right. Andrew, thanks so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. We touched on a load of really interesting topics. And I think you're an incredible neuroscience communicator. Everyone should go check out SenseofMind YouTube channel. You have a great podcast over there. You talk about lots of different things in a lot more depth than I do usually, which is great. We need that as well. And yeah, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Evan. And I will just say, when I discovered your channel, I was like blown away by the quality of what you're doing there, and I think people should absolutely check out what you're doing. I mean, I think there's I don't want to speak too broadly, but I don't think there's anyone out there doing what you're doing, so I'm really excited that you're in this landscape. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Andrew.